In the backstage of the Syrian war, a powerful European state played its cards. A sinister scheme involving a cement company and some of the most hated terror groups.
One of the country's largest companies.
It paid armed groups in Syria.
Declared the PKK a terrorist organization, but the U.S. continues
Financing Daesh. The documents reveal the French intelligence services
crimes against humanity charge in 2020.
Possibly more brutal than Bin Laden.
An intricate web covered by presidents,
A lot of documents, a lot of emails, internal memos.
ministers, diplomats,
Laurent Fabius.
Meanwhile, French President
La France a déjà Emmanuel Macron sur la Syrie. French economy minister rappelé qu'elles étaient.
the French secret services,
Lots of questions are being asked this morning.
Intelligence services should be overhauled.
Is it possible at this point to call it a failure of
last
French
year's
intelligence?
the European Union, and the Syrian regime. This is the untold story of a French covert operation with devastating consequences.
Daesh sent those death squads and you almost died that night. And now we know that the state can be implicated. How do you feel about that? The search for the truth about your son's death can be a long and hard struggle. Are you ready for it?
Bien sûr.
Good evening. We start with the breaking news out of Paris.
France was playing Germany
Bombs
tonight.
go off near the
A
stadium.
suicide bomber exploding his
We heard
vest.
2 explosions.
City under terror attack on several
First
fronts.
explosion echoed through the Stade de France shortly after 9 p.m.
They were shooting everybody because I was afraid the guys would come out with their guns and shot the people in the street.
Gunmen with Kalashnikov-type
Gunmen
assault
opened
weapons.
fire on bloody scenes unfolded at randomly road.
Chaos on the streets of Paris tonight.
hostage
Dry
blood in the streets
First at Le Carillon and Le Petit Cambodge. 15 people were killed.
At 9:36, gunmen in a similar vehicle opened fire at La
Sheer
Belle
terror.
Équipe
The
bar
same
at
block
92
the
Rue
crowd
de
of terror
Charon.
sprayed with
2
gunfire.
gunmen, one at least with explosives.
At least 4 restaurants and bars were hit in just a matter of
Several
minutes.
hours, the sound of gunfire could
The
be heard.
epicenter of the attack, though, would be the Bataclan. Those who escaped, the survivors, called it a massacre, a mass execution.
J'ai rampé jusqu'à la sortie de secours. Je m'arrêtais dès qu'il y avait des gens qui bouchaient devant moi ou quoi que ce soit. Beaucoup de gens se sont relevés pour courir vers là-bas et je pense se sont pris des balles.
Gunmen with Kalashnikovs reported.
Hostages inside the theatre had been killed.
Terrorists had started killing the hostages.
Tout de suite, j'ai essayé d'appeler sur son portable et évidemment, il n'a pas répondu puisqu'il était déjà couché dans la fosse et sans doute déjà atteint par les balles des terroristes.
This is the moment that the Bataclan was stormed. Now, whether we've got some people being rescued, it appears too late because the reports are at least 100 people have died in that theatre.
On apprend dans la matinée que Valentin est décédé.
J'ai vu ce soir-là des gens paniquer, j'ai vu des gens allongés, j'ai vu des gens pleins de sang. Mais voilà, ce que je garde, c'est toutes ces sensations horribles, plus qu'une chose définie ou une personne en particulier dont je peux dire « je l'ai vue morte », malheureusement. Ça me poursuivra toujours.
Friday night, November 13, 2015. Paris is rocked by a series of attacks on a stadium and popular night spots. 130 people were killed and hundreds injured. Hours after the attacks, the then president, François Hollande, unveils.
Les actes de guerre de vendredi ont été décidés, planifiés en Syrie.
ISIS in the last few hours has issued
Next day, Daesh claimed the responsibility.
French, in Russian, and in English.
After the initial shock wore off, many start asking why now and why France?
Is it possible at this point to call this failure French intelligence?
Turkey also reportedly warned France on two separate occasions.
Intelligence failure.
France's intelligence had failed.
The French Parliament set up a commission to assess the failure to prevent the attacks. The commission concluded the French intelligence could have prevented it. But the key to understanding why Daesh attacked Paris that Friday night was ignored by the inquiry commission. A cement factory in northern Syria, owned by the French multinational Lafarge, and its role in a state conspiracy.
French concrete giant Lafarge stands accused of making
crimes
what
against
called
humanity.
Financing
Daesh. The documents reveal that French intelligence services have been aware of this relationship.
To commit war
They tried
crimes.
to silence the story because it's embarrassing and because it was wrong.
Ce que je veux pour Valentin, pour que l'éternité, c'est la vérité.
The trial of 20 suspects in the November 13, 2015 terror attacks in Paris has started. It is the largest in French history. The case file spans 1 million pages. None of them mention Lafarge's affair and its links to the deadliest attacks to strike France since World War II. All wars have secrets. And Syria is no exception. Inside the walls of a now abandoned building in the country's north lies one of the darkest episodes of the Syrian war. Its story starts in the summer of 2008 in Paris.
Garde républicaine au garde à vous, tapis rouge. Pour la France, le maître de Damas n'est plus un paria. Le président de la République n'a pas hésité à descendre dans la cour pour le saluer.
The Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, and his wife were invited to France by President Nicolas Sarkozy. The French ambassador to Syria at the time was Michel Duclos.
Ismaël Assad s'est montré à l'occasion de ses visites à Paris. Elle a fait la une des journaux. C'est vrai que le couple Assad a été à la mode. Et vous savez, les Français sont très victimes des modes et des phénomènes de cour. Donc on a vu effectivement des ministres importants vouloir aller à Damas.
2 months later, Nicolas Sarkozy landed in Damascus.
Sarkozy se croyait original, disruptif, comme on dit maintenant, en renouant avec Bachar al-Assad.
Discussions between Assad and Sarkozy included the question of how to introduce Lafarge into the Syrian market. That same year of 2008, Lafarge bought the Middle East's biggest cement company, Orascom, from the Sawiris family for a scandalous amount of $12.8 billion. Egyptian tycoon Naguib Sawiris was a very close friend of the French president. But what was behind the sale that brought Lafarge to Syria? It's a topic not many are willing to broach.
Was Lafarge instructed by the French president to acquire Orascom assets in Syria?
Can I not respond to that? Then I will not respond to that. No, no, because I don't know what I can say on that. You're true. On pourra couper ça ou pas?
He wants us not to use this.
No, I don't want to respond to that.
No, it's okay.
Can you take it off? Because I don't know. You're right. What can I say? Yes, you're right.
Lafarge inherited a deal from Orascom to build Syria's first private cement factories in partnership with the local company MAS, owned by Syrian mogul Firas Tlas.
Je pense qu'ils étaient plutôt contents du fait que Firas Tlas était quelqu'un qui était très bien introduit dans le régime de Bachar el-Assad.
Firas Tlas is the son of former Syrian Defense Minister Mustafa Tlas and very close to the Assad clan.
La famille Tlas était historiquement considérée comme un des piliers de l'influence française en Syrie.
Lafarge Cement launched in Syria, backed by France and the Syrian regime. At first, the factory's location seemed trivial, but as the war progressed, the site would become Syria's most strategic area. It lies near the Turkey border and the M4 highway that links Syria to Iraq, and it's a stone's throw away from Aleppo, Kobani, and Raqqa. The project cost nearly $700 million to build, and we've obtained documents that show that it was paid for by funds from 16 banks, from Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, to a Danish state fund, as well as the French Development Agency. But the main investor was the European Union Bank. To realize the project, Lafarge founded a vast network of subsidiary companies. Among them was a firm incorporated under Cypriot law called Lafarge Cement Holding. It alone held 75% of the capital. These Lafarge divisions, sprawled across several countries, owned more than 98% of the cement factory in Syria. Firas Tlas held the rest. The European Union Bank alone contributed 45% of the total investment to the project, funded directly from the pockets of the European taxpayer. Normally, European Investment Bank loans are made public, but for this particular loan, no public records exist. Why should the EU hide the funds given to Lafarge? We tried to get an answer from the body's spokesperson.
I'm very surprised the millions given to Lafarge Syria are not here.
I cannot verify whether the EIB is hiding something or not, whether they are publishing everything they should. You should ask them, and I think they would be happy to reply to you.
So we did just that. But despite our attempts, the European Investment Bank responded with silence. By mid-2010, the Lafarge factory in Syria began churning out its first cement. But the plant had barely opened before the slabs began to crumble.
We turn to the latest powder keg in the Middle East, Syria.
On a day of unprecedented protests against President Bashar al-Assad.
And as the unrest spread,
followed a week of unrest, caused by
today, the nearby
activists
town of
for countrywide
Sanameh.
protest.
In March 2011, protests against the Assad regime erupted in southern Syria. A year later, thousands of people were dead, and fighting raged across the country. Spurred on by France, the EU imposed unprecedented sanctions on the Syrian regime.
We need to do something in order to show our disapproval with the brutal way the Assad regime started to proceed against the legitimate demands of his own population.
To avoid breaching the sanctions, foreign companies started fleeing Syria.
Once the EU sanctions are adopted, they are becoming basically a law which everyone has to obey.
But the French concrete giant Lafarge decided to stay.
Beaucoup de gens savaient qu'il y avait quelque chose de bizarre avec Lafarge en Syrie. La seule chose un petit peu compliquée, c'était de faire comprendre que vous aviez une usine qui fonctionnait dans un endroit où elle n'aurait jamais dû fonctionner.
From the reaction of its spokesperson, the EU is aware of Lafarge's affairs in Syria.
I don't know if you heard about a French multinational, Lafarge. So you are aware of what happened. How can you explain that the French multinational was operating in a country under sanctions with European Union funds?
Well, I think that's a very good question for the French authorities and for the representatives of this company.
But Lafarge invested in Syria with funds from the European Union Bank, so it's not only a French problem, but a European Union problem.
I'm not going to explain what the EIB is doing. I'm not going to comment on what EIB was giving to whomever because it's independent institution. I'm not able to explain on behalf of someone else.
But European Investment Bank belongs to whom?
Again, to member states.
The EU turned a blind eye, while one of the biggest European companies, financed by the EU bank, breached the sanctions. And so did France. Michel Sapin was the French Minister of Finance and EU Affairs at that time. His answer is surprising.
Pourquoi à ce moment-là, à partir de 2011, déjà, ça ne vous a pas alerté et il n'y a pas des sanctions qui ont été prises?
Moi, je ne me sens pas capable de savoir ce qui était à ce moment-là conforme aux règles et en particulier ce qui respectait ou ne respectait pas les sanctions.
Simplement, il faudra quand même m'expliquer comment une société qui est en Syrie peut respecter des sanctions qui interdisent de travailler avec la Syrie, puisqu'elle est dedans. Donc c'est pas possible. Là, je m'excuse, mais c'est pas possible.
Lafarge defied the EU sanctions, instructed by the French state. And we have the evidence to prove it. This classified document reveals a secret meeting that took place in the summer of 2012 at the Foreign Ministry in Paris. It was hosted by the French ambassador to Syria, Eric Chevalier, alongside Lafarge's vice president, Christian Hérault. Hérault reveals, in this first meeting, and we later had several more with Monsieur Chevalier, where we discussed the situation in Syria and the position of our factory. Monsieur Chevalier told me, you should stay. He was aware of the situation of the factory and always supported us without making the slightest observation.
Il est avéré que des cadres de Lafarge ont tenu au courant un certain nombre de fonctionnaires du Quai d'Orsay. Et je ne peux pas croire que ces informations-là ne soient pas remontées à ce ministre, ce d'autant plus que ce ministre est réputé pour tenir les ministères ou les organisations auxquelles il préside.
Vous ne donnez jamais son nom. Vous dites toujours ce ministre, mais vous ne le nommez jamais.
Oui, mais ce ministre c'était Laurent Fabius.
In November 2016, the factory's lid would slowly lift. French justice launches an investigation, and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Laurent Fabius, was summoned to the court.
Quand Laurent Fabius a été entendu par les juges d'instruction à notre demande, à l'époque ministre des Affaires étrangères, et d'autres responsables publics, bon, écoutez, c'est une blague cette histoire, c'est une sinistre blague.
Details of the hearing is among 500,000 documents leaked to us by a source close to the investigation. The former minister and the current president of the French Constitutional Council told investigators that he never even knew there was a French company operating in Syria.
Lorsqu'ils disent « nous ne savions pas ». Comment ça? Monsieur Fabius ne savait pas que Lafarge, une des plus grosses sociétés françaises, avait une usine dans une zone de guerre, sur un pays où il travaillait 5 heures par jour sur ce pays. Je n'y crois pas une seconde.
Fabius est coincé entre deux hypothèses. Soit il reconnaît qu'en tant que ministre, il ne faisait pas bien son boulot, soit il reconnaît qu'en tant que ministre, il était informé qu'il n'a rien fait. Alors qu'est-ce que vous faites dans ce cas-là? Vous n'allez pas participer à l'enquête. Soit vous êtes un incapable, soit vous êtes un criminel. Donc,
For the first time, saw a UN official describe the situation in Syria as a civil war.
The military route by the opposition. Ordinary Syrian people are the ones that are suffering.
Government forces moved in with crushing firepower.
Dropped on this neighborhood.
l'État français ait encouragé Lafarge à rester présent en Syrie, je ne suis pas sûr qu'ils aient réalisé quel était le coût et les implications de cette présence dans le fait de devoir payer des groupes armés, dont ISIS.
By 2012, Syria was gripped by full-scale civil war. The opposition to Assad's regime split into hundreds of armed groups. Under instructions by the French state and financial support from the EU, Lafarge devised a scheme to protect the routes for its cement and raw materials and keep the factory running. Remaining in a country plagued with armed groups had a cost, and Lafarge decided to pay, counting on a well-connected First Class, former Norwegian intelligence officer and now the Lafarge plant risk manager, Jakob Warnes, reached out to the armed groups. At the top of that list was the PKK, which controlled the area around the factory, and is listed as a terrorist organization by both the US and the European Union.
PKK effectivement est désigné comme une entité terroriste et des sanctions s'appliquent à ses membres et à cette organisation.
The PKK has run a terror campaign against Turkey for more than 4 decades. Since the 90s, Syria has been a safe haven for the group. The YPG is the Syrian offshoot of the PKK terror group.
À quel moment les gens de Lafarge auraient pu dire « on arrête » ? Est-ce que c'est quand les Kurdes arrivaient et commençaient avec des troubles sérieux ?
Lafarge knew who they were dealing with. In this leaked email, the CEO of Lafarge Cement Syria writes, "We all have to stop using the acronym of an organization which is on a terrorist list. From now on, we will use Bayada instead." The leaked information shows that from 2011, Lafarge diverted millions in funds to the PKK to guarantee the protection of the plant, taxes, donations, but also to release its employees, often kidnapped by the PKK. This is just one of many documents showing how the money was redirected to the terror group. The first payment was made without invoices and transferred to MAS, owned by TLAS, who was in charge of distributing the funds. Firas Tlas became a key figure in the process. He was no longer just a shareholder of Lafarge Syria, but also a middleman between the company and armed groups. And, as an incentive, Lafarge decided to increase his shares from a modest 1.33% to 10%. But as a main investor, the EU bank still had to approve the operation. Tlas was a man connected to a regime under sanctions, and the factory was in an area effectively run by armed groups. Yet, going by this email, the EU bank had few qualms. Suddenly, Lafarge's scheme suffered a setback.
Some breaking news today out of Syria. A defection of a top Syrian general.
A close personal friend of President Assad has deserted and left the country.
He escaped the country with help from France.
The Tlas clan had turned against the Assad regime.
Au bout d'un moment, on a fait comprendre à Firas Tlas et d'ailleurs à son frère Manaf que ça suffisait comme ça. Ils ont été plus ou moins en résidence surveillée et finalement ils se sont enfuis.
Il est clair que Tlas était reçu à l'ambassade. Et il est clair que c'était des habitués, des visites en France. Lorsqu'il a pensé qu'il était temps pour lui de fuir et de venir en France, tout naturellement, il est passé par les Français.
Firas's brother Manaf and father Mustafa defected to France with the help from French intelligence. While his brother and father settled down in Paris, Firas took shelter in the United Arab Emirates. The Syrian regime starts the process to confiscate Tlas's assets, including MAS, the company used by Lafarge to divert the funds. In this email, the director of Lafarge Syria, Bruno Pesciu, tells the company's vice president about growing pressure from the regime to stop the payments to Firas Tlas and the need to find an offshore entity to channel the funds. And that's when another accomplice enters the equation. This leaked document from October 2012 shows the funds to the armed groups were now being diverted through a company called Brazil Bridge DWC. In one of the leaked documents, we can see the company is based in the UAE and belongs to Firas Tlas. This invoice, issued in Dubai by Brazil Bridge DWC to Lafarge, shows that the amounts should be paid in cash to a terror group designated by Firas Tlas, and that group is the PKK and its Syrian affiliate, the PYD. The United Arab Emirates has now become a platform from where Lafarge diverted funds to the armed groups. But Lafarge also resorted to other means to divert money to the PKK terror group. In this email chain between Lafarge Syria and the Paris headquarters, the factory operations manager talks of a meeting with a person by the name Shire. He is identified as a senior PKK commander in northern Syria. The PKK representative offers protection to the plant in exchange for money to fund its terror campaign, and suggests issuing fake invoices via a local Syrian company called Silica, and the advice is taken on board. These financial statements contain hundreds of payments Lafarge made to Silica disguised as purchases of raw materials. Paris was well aware of Lafarge funding the PKK terror group. This classified diplomatic note sent by the French embassy in Amman to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs speaks of the PKK's intentions to transform the factory into a military base, and how it's plausible considering the site's infrastructure. Overall, say the French diplomats, the Kurds love us.
Le PKK, voilà. Ils avaient été reçus en France, notamment à l'Élysée, au moment des discussions sur la Syrie.
Les Français ont vu d'un bon œil que les Kurdes s'installent dans le nord, le long de la frontière turque, et il y avait de bonnes relations entre les Français et les Kurdes.
Here, we see that between 2012 and 2015, the French ambassador in charge of Syria at the Quai d'Orsay was regularly informed of the situation at the factory. Lafarge's vice president, Hérault, says, besides the fact that we have always been encouraged to stay, the only concern expressed was to do nothing that might irritate the Turks. He was aware of the racketeering. I told him that it was Firas Tlas who managed things. Monsieur Chevalier told me that he happened to meet Monsieur Tlas in consultations on the future of Syria.
The PKK is listed as a terror group.
Ah mais indiscutablement, je vous l'ai dit, indiscutablement, les Européens, enfin les Américains et les Français en particulier, ont soutenu dans la guerre en Syrie des groupes qui étaient des groupes qui encourageaient le terrorisme en Europe.
L'État français aurait pu laisser se perpétuer des financements totalement illégaux vis-à-vis d'organisations terroristes sur place.
By the end of 2012, Lafarge was already channeling funds to all the armed groups in Syria, including those linked to Al-Qaeda. But the biggest beneficiary was still the PKK.
Tout ça a des conséquences. L'argent, les armements des YPG qu'on a donnés aux YPG ont servi en Turquie pour faire des attentats contre les forces de sécurité turques.
Putting money in the pockets of armed groups in a country at war had a cost, and it soon pushed Lafarge Syria into a financial pit, unable to pay back the investors. The Syrian regime had also begun putting pressure on Lafarge to cut ties with Firas Tlas. the Syrian finance minister gave clear orders to freeze all payments to the now outcast middleman. With the Syrian regime about to become a partner in the project, investors like the EU Bank and the French Development Agency also demanded a full refund. Lafarge began feeling the heat, as suggested by this document, where the company's finance department cautions that an early repayment may bankrupt Lafarge Syria and force it to suspend all operations. But the French state would come to the rescue. In this email, a French diplomat asks Lafarge for information about investors demanding their loans be paid back. And Lafarge responds to the Foreign Ministry with details about the money borrowed from the French Development Agency. And it seems this was all that was needed. In March 2013, the factory CEO revealed that an agreement had been reached with the French Development Agency and the European Investment Bank to refinance the loan. The EU Bank had just agreed to restructure the debt of a company working with EU funds in a country under EU sanctions.
Nous espérons que ce prochain pas pourra être franchi pour pouvoir demander d'étudier la responsabilité aussi de la Banque européenne d'investissement, puisque les citoyens ne peuvent pas être responsables malgré eux de financement de terrorisme ou de complicité de crimes contre l'humanité d'une telle banque qui est censée financer des projets de développement.
Once more, the EU spokesperson avoids going into detail.
The proper investigation needs to show actually what happened, if it indeed happened the way how media describe, because again, not everything the media is writing about must necessarily be true. I'm not saying this applies for this particular...
It's true because we have the document.
You know, we don't live in a world of black and white.
Did the European Union ask some explanations from France?
So far, we have no reason to think that our French partners would have no interest in clarify what was happening in Syria in the case of the company Lafarge.
L'investisseur qui est la banque devait normalement demander des comptes à Lafarge pour conditionner le maintien de son prêt. Donc il devait être au courant de l'implication du maintien de l'activité de l'usine et donc cette implication auprès de groupes armés pour pouvoir réellement maintenir son activité.
With help from the EU Bank and French public funds, Lafarge was able to keep its Syrian factory running. But the worst is yet to come.
These fighters are barbaric in a way no flag for you, known as ISIS, has seized vast territory in Syria and Iraq.
A state of terror, armed and determined to kill.
This execution, while no more vile than any of the others, may be different in terms.
The world's most ruthless terror organization makes its move on Syria and establishes its capital in Raqqa, a step away from the Lafarge factory.
Mais là, on paye à des gens. En 2014. On paye à des gens. Juin 2014, le califat est annoncé, le califat. Juin. Et on continue à tourner. Le califat qui est pas loin. C'est quand même invraisemblable.
This email, sent by the factory risk manager to Paris in October 2013, clearly states that the situation in Syria had become unstable, but that access to the plant was normal and without any obstacles due to a long-term agreement with Daesh. From the spring of 2013, Daesh gradually took control of the towns and roads surrounding the factory. Lafarge established an underground relation with Daesh to keep the roads open for its workers and deliveries.
Lafarge avait traité directement et indirectement avec des représentants de l'État islamique pour continuer à faire fonctionner son usine.
Lafarge dealt with Daesh through middlemen. Firas Klas was one of them. But by 2013, a new character had entered the fold. This document from the judicial investigation shows that Lafarge recruited Amro Taleb in April, officially as an environmental consultant.
Les mails montrent que Amro Taleb servait bien d'intermédiaire pour recevoir les fonds, notamment entre Daesh, d'autres groupes armés et l'entreprise.
And the proof is in an email where Amro Taleb introduces himself as the man who represents Daesh and the PKK. But the layers to this story continue to deepen. This confidential document from French military intelligence shows that French secret services knew more than just the real nature of Taleb's association with Lafarge. He's described as a Syrian-Canadian citizen, with close ties to former US Ambassador Robert Farrand and the US intelligence.
Je pense que c'est ce qu'on appelle un opportuniste et un profiteur de guerre. Que c'est quelqu'un qui a joué un jeu assez dangereux. Bon courage pour la justice d'essayer de comprendre parmi les multiples cartes de visite qu'il a.
Searching through the leaked documents, we found this exchange, where the factory CEO forwards an email from Taleb to Lafarge's security director. In it, Taleb says he is the only person mediating between all parties: Lafarge, the French embassy in Ankara, and Daesh.
C'était aussi un intermédiaire apparemment entre les ambassadeurs et Lafarge et les groupes armés. C'était quelqu'un qui, on peut dire, savait parler à tout type de personnes.
But what exactly the French embassy in Ankara was negotiating with Daesh is a secret kept hidden by the French state.
Je n'ai pas vu au dossier que les services de l'État, le Quai d'Orsay ou d'autres, aient dit à Lafarge, vous fermez, parce que d'ailleurs s'ils l'avaient dit, ils auraient fermé. Ils n'avaient pas le pouvoir s'ils avaient dit, vous n'avez pas le droit d'aller sur zone, vous n'avez pas le droit de continuer.
By mid-2013, Lafarge Syria had a new risk assessment manager, a certain Ahmad Jaloudi, who was well known to First Plus.
Ahmad Jaloudi worked for the Jordanian intelligence and for Lafarge.
And Lafarge management was in touch with Jordanian intelligence also. They had several meetings in Amman.
Yeah, they have, of course.
Jaloudi was now in charge of getting the all-clear from Daesh to keep the factory operating. In this email, titled Visiting Raqqa After Tomorrow, Jaloudi explains how Daesh had discovered that part of the fuel it sold to the factory was being diverted to the PKK, and that the most senior Daesh leader in Raqqa was requesting a meeting at its self-proclaimed capital, Raqqa. Lafarge's Syria CEO, Bruno Pesciu, tells Jaloudi, asking him to hear out their requests, "We need to coordinate with all parties involved," he says.
They've changed their name, but not their tactics. Declared all areas it's overtaken in Syria and Iraq to be a caliphate.
Extraordinary and awful.
An American journalist has been beheaded by ISIS terrorists.
From late 2013, Daesh became the main provider of raw materials such as pozzolana, sand and oil to Lafarge's factory.
Il faut se rappeler qu'à l'époque, Daesh et les autres, que leurs revenus provenaient pour moitié du pétrole. Pour moitié du pétrole. Ou d'autres matières. Donc l'idée qu'ils aient pu être ignorants de ce que faisaient ces groupes terroristes est un crachat sur les victimes, est un crachat sur les juges.
Intermediaries like Amro Taleb and First Plus negotiated with Daesh through local businessmen. Lafarge made the payments to the bank accounts of Taleb and Plus in Lebanon, and from there the money was diverted to Daesh.
ISIS has now become a financial power that's grown.
Islamic State has declared a cross-border caliphate.
Islamic
in the
State
territory
is now
it
thought
controls
to be
in
the
Syria
world's
and Iraq.
richest
ISIL now controls more than 95,000 square kilometers in Syria, which is 50% of the country's.
From the early days of the Syrian operation, Lafarge devised an intricate financial scheme to keep the money flowing to armed groups. The Lafarge Group in Paris served as a guarantor for banks and public institutions like the EU Bank and French Development Agency. The money would flow from Paris through several Lafarge subsidiaries in Cyprus, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, and then diverted to Syria as intercompany loans or service provisions. Here is an example of a scheme to erase the money trail. Lafarge SA owns 100% of Sofimo, a subsidiary headquartered in Paris. Sofimo owns 100% of Lafarge Cement Holding registered in Cyprus, which in turn owns 98.53% of Lafarge Cement Syria. Lafarge also set up a company called Sabelfi, which it used to transfer funds to banks in Lebanon, Egypt, and Lafarge's subsidiaries in the UAE, but also private accounts. An audit carried out by PricewaterhouseCoopers showed that between 2009 and December 2014, Lafarge Syria was financed by a loan from Lafarge Cement Holding and an external funding of $340 million. 19 lenders took part in this deal, the main ones being the European Investment Bank and the French Development Agency. Between 2011 and 2015, thousands of dollars were diverted from European public funds and banks to Lafarge's subsidiaries, only to end up in the pockets of terror groups like the PKK and Daesh.
Lafarge invested in Syria with European Union funds.
I'm not going to speak on behalf of EIB. I'm not going to speak on behalf of money which might have been or might not have been given to whomever in whatever amount, because this is not our role. We are aware of this case. They for sure have the explanations. I mean, I'm sure they have the explanations for what they did. For what they did, maybe, I don't know, humanistic, like they wanted to keep the job.
But the law is clear about something called the fungibility of the money.
À partir du moment où on considère que les fonds, l'argent est fongible, on considère que l'argent qui vient d'un investisseur à hauteur de millions d'euros qui ont ensuite été versés à des groupes armés et Daesh constitue le même argent, le même circuit financier.
But how much did Lafarge pay Daesh to keep its factory running throughout the war? The ongoing investigation in France has so far obtained evidence for around $16 million. But the documents leaked to us suggest it could be a lot more. This confidential report, prepared by the audit firm PwC, shows that between October 2013 and July 2014, the French multinational paid 2 Daesh businessmen nearly $1.2 million for raw materials. And a third Daesh businessman received almost $1.4 million for the purchase of pozzolana. In July and August 2014, Lafarge transferred more than $5.3 million to Firas Tlass's company as security payments, to be diverted to the armed groups, and around $4 million for Firas himself for his services. Lafarge also paid a further $3.3 million to 16 suppliers in Daesh's so-called capital, Raqqa.
Si un jour la preuve était rapportée que de façon très spécifique, l'argent qui a été fourni à ce moment-là a servi de cagnotte de tirelire pour financer les opérations kamikazes en Europe, là on va faire un saut absolument stratosphérique. Mais on n'en est pas là pour l'instant.
In February 2014, the factory CEO assures Paris headquarters that the situation with Daesh is relatively calm, and another purchase of pozzolana and fuel is just being finalized. But a few months later, Amro Talab informs Lafarge that Daesh is currently fighting the PKK for full control of the factory. It is evident that behind the official discourse, part of the battle between Daesh and the PKK was not related to the war itself, but over the Lafarge cement factory. In July 2014, the factory CEO informs Lafarge's vice director that production at the plant had ceased, while an agreement was being negotiated with Daesh and the Syrian branch of the PKK. The same day, Firas Tlass reports that he has begun talks with Daesh in Dubai. The same document reveals the representatives of the Syrian branch of the PKK were also present during those meetings. In August 2014, at a time when hundreds of civilians were being massacred for the world to see, Lafarge reaches a new deal with Daesh and the PKK. The French multinational paid to both terror groups to keep the routes open for its products, to keep its factories safe, the raw materials to feed the production needs, taxes, but also donations and ransoms to release its employees, kidnapped by both the YPG and Daesh. The need to feed Daesh and the PKK forced Lafarge to disperse thousands of dollars every week. Once again, this put the company in financial trouble. This financial report states the group needed to inject $12 million to give Lafarge Syria a small buffer. The company then began another round of talks with investors, but it suffered a serious blow in August 2014 when the Syrian regime seized First Class's shares in Lafarge Syria. The EU bank was unable to hide anymore. According to this internal email, the bank informed Lafarge it intended on asking for an early repayment of the loan. There is no evidence that the EU bank followed through with the demand, or that Lafarge ever paid the money back. Officially, they were fighting the financing of terrorism.
On ne jouera plus avec le financement pour Daesh et Al-Qaïda ou tous les groupes associés à ces derniers.
Asking others to join the fight.
J'appelle le système financier à couper les sources d'alimentation du terrorisme.
Behind the scenes, another story was unfolding.
Pourquoi et grâce à qui, notamment, elle a pu continuer son activité? Pourquoi aucun acteur n'a mis le holà à ses activités?
The president of France at the time was François Hollande. The minister of finance was Michel Sapin, while Laurent Fabius was in charge of foreign affairs. In August 2014, when Lafarge was already financing Daesh, Emmanuel Macron was the Minister of Economy, responsible for major French investments abroad. Did they know? The answer is yes. This diplomatic note, sent by the French embassy in Amman to government officials, clearly states that Lafarge kept its factory operating by playing a tricky game with the Damascus regime, the PKK, and Daesh. The diplomats tell Paris that the factory is located in an area under PKK control, but also very close to Daesh. And despite the uncomfortable situation, Lafarge is doing its best to keep the site operational. The note was received by the French Treasury Department within Sapin's office.
Donc, nous avons en notre possession des documents qui prouvent qu'il y a eu des échanges entre le ministère des Affaires étrangères parlant du fait que Lafarge avait des transactions avec le pouvoir de Damas, avec les Kurdes, mais aussi avec ISIS, l'État islamique. Est-ce que vous étiez au courant?
Là aussi, il faut voir le contexte, qui est un contexte extrêmement délicat, où pour Lafarge, très compliqué de savoir quel peut être l'interlocuteur et quel est le danger que peut présenter cet interlocuteur. On peut comprendre que les gens de Lafarge cherchent à faire en sorte que cette usine fonctionne le plus longtemps possible. Sauf qu'en l'occurrence, ils ont été au-delà des limites admissibles.
C'est un peu bizarre de dire ça. Est-ce qu'il veut voler au secours de l'entreprise Lafarge? Moi, ce que j'aurais attendu, ce que j'attendrais des politiques, c'est de dire leur indignation absolue, radicale, intransigeante sur ce qui s'est passé.
All these diplomatic notes had yet another addressee, the Directorate General for the Enterprise. It's a body that answers directly to the Minister of Economy, who, at the time, was none other than the now President of France, Emmanuel Macron.
On ne peut pas penser une seconde que l'État, les services de renseignement ne savaient pas que Lafarge était en contact, en face, avec d'abord des rebelles, puis ensuite avec ISIS, enfin avec l'État islamique. Ça, c'est clair.
Comment dire? Tout ça est un vaste tableau dans lequel Lafarge est un tout petit point.
The following events will show just how far Lafarge and the French state went to keep the cement factory in Syria open for business.
Lafarge was in a very close relation with ISIS.
So, it was her last question.